Sometimes the cruelest wounds are inflicted not by enemies, but by those who once called you friend. Marta knows this truth better than most, sitting alone in her cottage while the village she once served with her healing hands now whispers her name like a curse. In the medieval village of Ravenscroft, Baron Aldric hosts his annual harvest feast. This year, a mysterious nobleman named Lord Valen arrives. He has pale skin, dark eyes, and an ageless face that unsettles everyone. The villagers warn him about Marta, the large woman they fear and mock. But when the feast begins, Valen walks past all the empty seats beside lords and ladies. He sits down next to Marta, the woman everyone told him to avoid. The great hall falls silent. What does this strange, powerful man want with the village outcast? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The autumn wind carried the scent of wood smoke and roasted grain through the narrow streets of Ravenscroft, where thatched roofs huddled together like old women sharing secrets. Marta pulled her worn woolen shawl tighter around her shoulders as she watched the preparations for Baron Aldric's harvest feast from her cottage window. The silver healing pendant, once blessed by Father Benedict when she was the village's most beloved healer, pressed cold against her throat, hidden beneath layers of rough-spun fabric, like everything else precious she had left. 20 years had passed since the fever took little Thomas Blackwood, the miller's son. 20 years since whispers began that Marta's healing had grown too strange, too powerful, too unnatural for godly folk to trust. The same hands that had once pulled their children back from death's door were now feared as instruments of dark magic. The woman who had spent sleepless nights brewing remedies and tending to the sick was now the witch they crossed themselves against when she passed. Marta's fingers traced the leather spine of her healer's journal, its pages filled with pressed herbs and careful notes about every life she had saved. Her grandmother's wisdom lived within those yellowed pages, recipes for fever-breaking teas, salves for wounds that wouldn't heal, and gentle words that eased pain as surely as any potion. The journal had been her most treasured possession, but dust gathered on it now, like snow on a forgotten grave. "She grows larger each year," came Elena Hartwell's sharp voice from the street below. Once, Elena had been Marta's closest friend, bringing her sick daughter to Marta's door with tears of gratitude. Now she led the chorus of mockery that followed Marta through the village square. "Mark my words, Margaret, it's not natural food that feeds her bulk. It's the dark forces she consorts with." Margaret Fletcher, the baker's wife, murmured agreement. "My husband says she talks to her herbs like they're living things, makes them grow when the ground should be barren." Marta closed her eyes against the familiar sting of their words. Yes, she spoke to her plants. Had they forgotten how she once coaxed healing flowers to bloom in winter frost to save their loved ones? But memory was a fragile thing when fear took root in hearts that had once been grateful. The village of Ravenscroft nestled in a valley between rolling hills, its main road worn smooth by generations of carts carrying grain to market. The Baron's manor house stood on the highest ground, its stone walls weathered but strong, overlooking cottages that seemed to shrink smaller each year as prosperity fled to larger towns. Baron Aldric ruled with a steady hand, neither cruel nor particularly kind, maintaining the old traditions that kept his people fed through harsh winters. The harvest feast was one such tradition, dating back to his grandfather's time. Every autumn, after the grain was safely stored and the ale had finished brewing, the great hall would fill with villagers from the lowest serf to the most prosperous merchant. For one night, social boundaries softened as shared gratitude for another year's survival warmed hearts like mulled wine. Marta had attended every feast until 5 years ago, when Baron Aldric's steward had suggested her presence might disturb the other guests' enjoyment. She understood the polite dismissal for what it was, exile wrapped in courteous words. Since then, she watched the preparations from afar, remembering the taste of honey cakes and the sound of laughter that once included her own. This year felt different, though she couldn't say why. Perhaps it was the way the very air seemed to hum with anticipation, or how her dried herbs rustled in their bundles without any breeze to stir them. Something was coming to Ravenscroft, something that made her long-dormant healing senses tingle with recognition. The stranger had arrived 3 days ago, just as the moon entered its dark phase. Lord Valen, he called himself, though no one had heard of his family name or the lands he claimed to rule. He rode alone on a black stallion, whose hooves made no sound on the cobblestones, carrying only a small leather pack and wearing clothes that spoke of wealth without ostentation. His face held the kind of ageless beauty that belonged in illuminated manuscripts, sharp cheekbones, pale skin unmarked by sun or labor, and eyes the color of winter storms. Baron Aldric had welcomed him with the cautious hospitality reserved for nobles of uncertain origin. A place was prepared at the high table, chambers were cleaned and aired, and the best wine was brought up from the cellars. But the servants whispered among themselves, crossing their fingers against evil when they thought no one was looking. There was something about Lord Valen that unsettled even the boldest souls, the way shadows seemed to follow him, how his reflection appeared strangely dim in polished surfaces, and the absolute silence that fell over the stable cats whenever he passed. Marta had glimpsed him only once, when she ventured to the market square for herbs that wouldn't grow in her carefully tended garden. He stood near the church steps, speaking quietly with Father Benedict, and even at a distance she felt the weight of his attention, like winter frost on her skin. Their eyes had met across the crowded square for just a moment, but that moment stretched like honey from a spoon, thick with recognition that should have been impossible. Father Benedict had baptized Marta as an infant and blessed her healing work when she took up her grandmother's calling. He was a good man, neither quick to judge nor slow to forgive, but lately his sermons carried undertones of concern about unnatural influences creeping into their peaceful community. He still nodded to Marta when their paths crossed, but the warmth had cooled to polite distance. "The harvest has been bountiful this year," the father had announced from his pulpit the previous Sunday, his weathered hands gripping the worn wood. "Let us remember that all gifts come from the Almighty, and beware those who would claim power that belongs to Him alone." Marta knew those words were meant for her, though her name was never spoken. The healing abilities that ran in her family's bloodline had always walked a careful line between divine blessing and suspicious witchcraft. Her grandmother had warned her to hide the full extent of her gifts, to let people believe her success came from knowledge rather than the strange energy that flowed through her hands when she touched the sick. The Baron's feast preparations continued below her window as servants hurried back and forth, carrying armloads of harvest decorations. Sheaves of golden wheat adorned every doorway, and the sweet scent of baking bread drifted from the kitchens where the cooks worked through the night. Apple tarts cooled on wooden shelves, their crusts golden as autumn leaves, while great haunches of meat turned slowly over the cooking fires. Young Timothy Fletcher, Margaret's boy, ran past Marta's cottage, chasing a escaped chicken, his laughter bright as silver bells. Once, Marta had cured his lung fever with a tea brewed from moonflower petals and whispered prayers. His mother had wept with gratitude, pressing a small bag of precious salt into Marta's hands as payment. Now Margaret hurried him past Marta's door with warnings about the evil woman who lived inside. The irony cut deeper than any blade. Marta's cottage sat on the edge of the village proper, far enough from the main road to avoid casual visitors, but close enough that desperate souls could find her when all other hope had fled. They still came sometimes, these secret supplicants, always after dark, always alone, always swearing her to silence. A merchant's wife whose womb had been barren for 12 years. A blacksmith whose hands shook too badly to hold his tools. Children born with twisted limbs or clouded sight. She helped them all, just as she always had, asking no payment beyond what they could afford. But they left her door carrying shame along with their healing, as if accepting her aid marked them as conspirators in some unnamed sin. They healed quickly under her care, their gratitude genuine but temporary, fading as soon as their need passed. The leather journal lay open on her wooden table, its pages filled with pressed flowers and careful drawings of healing plants. Each entry told a story of someone saved, some pain eased, some family kept whole. But the last entry was dated 3 months ago, a farmer's broken ribs mended after his horse had thrown him. Since then, the pages remained blank, though her garden still flourished with impossible abundance, and her healing herbs grew stronger each passing season. Sometimes, in the deep hours of night when sleep eluded her, Marta wondered if the villagers were right to fear her. Her abilities had grown stronger over the years, not weaker, as if some hidden wellspring of power fed them from beneath the surface of the world. She could sense illness from across a room, feel the rhythm of heartbeats through stone walls, and coax life from seeds that should have been long dead. These gifts had come with no instruction manual, no wise teacher to explain their limits or their costs. Her grandmother's voice echoed in memory. "The blood remembers what the mind forgets, child. Our family carries an old debt and an older promise. Someday, when the need is greatest, you'll understand the true measure of what you carry." Those words had made little sense when Marta was young and eager to heal every scratch and sniffle in the village. They made even less sense now, when she sat alone with her unused gifts, while the people she might have helped suffered in ignorant silence. But lately, as autumn deepened toward winter, the words had begun to feel like prophecy rather than riddle. The wind shifted, carrying new sounds from the village center, the creak of cartwheels, the jingle of harness bells, the excited chatter of children glimpsing something wonderful. Lord Valen's arrival had stirred Ravenscroft from its usual autumn lethargy, though whether the change would prove beneficial remained to be seen. Marta closed the leather journal and placed it carefully in the wooden chest that held her most precious possessions. Tonight, the village would feast and celebrate another year's survival. She would watch from her window, as she had for the past 5 years, and try not to remember the taste of community she had lost. But something deep in her bones whispered that this harvest feast would be different, that the mysterious Lord Valen carried with him the seeds of changes none of them could imagine. The silver pendant at her throat seemed to pulse with its own heartbeat, warm against her skin for the first time in months. Whatever was coming, her grandmother's blood recognized it, even if her conscious mind remained in darkness. The old debt and the older promise stirred in her veins like spring sap rising in winter trees, preparing for a season of growth that would either heal the wounds of the past or tear them open beyond all repair. The great hall of Baron Aldric's manor blazed with candlelight and the warm glow of the massive stone hearth. Tapestries depicting ancient hunts adorned the walls, their rich colours made deeper by dancing shadows. Long wooden tables groaned under the weight of the harvest bounty. Roasted fowl stuffed with herbs, wheels of aged cheese, loaves of bread still warm from the ovens, and flagons of ale that caught the firelight like liquid amber. Marta watched from her cottage window as the villagers streamed through the manor's oak doors, their Sunday finest brushed clean and their faces bright with anticipation. Children darted between their parents' legs, eyes wide at the promise of honey cakes and sweet cider. Even the poorest families had managed some small improvement to their appearance. A freshly mended cloak, a ribbon in a daughter's hair, a carefully cleaned pair of boots. She had dressed carefully herself, though she knew not why. Her best gown, deep blue wool that brought out her eyes, hung loose where it had once been snug. The silver pendant lay visible against her throat for the first time in years, catching what little light filtered through her small window. Perhaps it was foolish hope, but some part of her still believed she might find the courage to join them, to reclaim her place among neighbours who had once welcomed her presence. The sound of hoofbeats on cobblestone drew her attention to the manor's courtyard. Lord Valen approached on his silent black stallion, his dark cloak flowing behind him like liquid shadow. Even at this distance, Marta could see the way the horse's breath failed to mist in the cold air, how the animal moved with unnatural grace across the uneven stones. As Valen dismounted, his boots touched ground with barely a whisper of sound. Baron Aldric emerged from the manor to greet his mysterious guest, flanked by his steward and 2 guards whose hands rested perhaps too casually on their sword hilts. The Baron wore his finest doublet, burgundy velvet with gold thread, but somehow he appeared diminished beside the pale stranger. Their conversation was too distant for words to carry, but Marta could read tension in their postures, in the way Aldric's smile never quite reached his eyes. "Stay away from the fat witch," Elena's voice drifted up from the courtyard below, where she intercepted Lord Valen near the manor steps. Marta's former friend wore her scarlet dress, the one saved for special occasions, and her greying hair was braided with strips of colourful cloth. "She'll curse you soon as look at you, my lord. Been nothing but trouble since her grandmother died, and left her alone with all those dark books." Valen's response was too quiet to hear, but Marta saw Elena's face flush with embarrassment before she bobbed a curtsy and hurried into the hall. Others approached the mysterious nobleman with similar warnings, their voices carrying fragments of caution and superstition on the autumn wind. "Unnatural she is," declared Marcus the blacksmith, his massive frame made larger by his best leather vest. "My mare went lame just from passing her cottage. Had to put the poor beast down." "Talks to demons in languages that ain't Christian," added Sarah the seamstress, crossing herself vigorously. "My cousin's boy heard her chanting when he was gathering berries near her garden. Scared him so bad he wet himself." Each warning carved deeper into Marta's heart, but Lord Valen listened to them all with the same polite attention, nodding at appropriate moments, while his storm-grey eyes remained unreadable. His fingers toyed with something at his throat, a ring or pendant hidden beneath his high collar, and Marta caught the brief gleam of red stone whenever his hand moved. The bloodstone ring seemed to pulse with its own light, though perhaps that was merely candlelight reflected through the manor's windows. But something about that crimson gleam made Marta's healing senses flutter like birds before a storm. Power recognized power, her grandmother had always said, even across the vast darkness that separated different kinds of magic. Father Benedict approached last, his brown robes simple among the feast-day finery of the other guests. The priest's words were lost in distance, but his gestures spoke of blessing and warning combined. He made the sign of the cross over Lord Valen, who accepted the blessing with bowed head and appropriate reverence. Yet when their hands touched in parting, both men pulled back as if burned, and Marta saw Father Benedict rub his palm against his robes with troubled expression. Inside the great hall, the feast had begun in earnest. Through the tall windows, Marta could see figures moving in the golden light, servants weaving between tables with platters of food, while minstrels tuned their instruments for evening entertainment. The sound of laughter and conversation drifted on the night air, warm and welcoming as summer rain to drought-parched earth. Lord Valen stood at the threshold for a long moment, his pale face turned toward the light and warmth within. From her distant window, Marta thought she saw something like longing cross his features, as if he too stood outside, looking in at a world that had forgotten how to welcome him. Then he straightened his shoulders and stepped inside, and the great oak doors swung shut behind him. Baron Aldric's voice rose above the general din as he called for attention. "Good friends and neighbors, we gather tonight to celebrate another year of God's bounty. Let us give thanks for grain safely gathered, for flocks grown fat, for children healthy and strong." The assembled crowd raised their cups. In response, voices joining in the traditional blessing that had marked harvest feasts for generations. "And let us welcome our honored guest," the Baron continued, his tone carefully neutral. "Lord Valen, who travels far from his northern holdings to share in our celebration." Marta pressed closer to her window, breath fogging the glass as she strained to see into the hall. Lord Valen stood beside the Baron's chair at the head table, tall and elegant in his dark clothing, acknowledging the polite applause with a slight bow. But instead of taking the seat prepared for him among the other nobles and wealthy merchants, he remained standing, his eyes scanning the crowded hall as if searching for something. Or someone. The murmur of conversation gradually died as people noticed Valen's hesitation. Baron Aldric gestured toward the empty chair, confusion creasing his brow, but the mysterious nobleman shook his head with a slight smile. He stepped down from the raised platform and began walking among the lower tables, past surprised faces and hastily whispered prayers. "What's he doing?" Margaret Fletcher hissed to her husband, loud enough for half the hall to hear. "Looking for trouble, if you ask me," Elena muttered from her place among the merchant families. "Mark my words, no good will come of this night." But Lord Valen continued his measured progress through the hall, past empty chairs that would have welcomed him gladly, past tables of prosperous families who watched his passage with mounting bewilderment. He walked as if following an invisible path, his steps certain despite the maze of benches and servants that filled the great space. At the very back of the hall, in the shadows beneath the minstrel's gallery, sat a small table meant for the least important guests. The village outcasts claimed their places there. The drunk who swept the church steps for coins, the simple-minded girl who helped in the kitchens, the old woman whose husband had died of plague and left her with nothing but debts. And there, in the darkest corner where she had hoped to remain invisible, sat Marta. She had entered through the servant's door, moving carefully along the wall until she found the furthest seat from any who might object to her presence. Her blue gown had seemed fine in her cottage mirror, but here among the feast-day splendor, it appeared threadbare and patched. The silver pendant at her throat felt suddenly heavy, like a chain rather than a cherished keepsake. Lord Valen stopped before her table, and the great hall fell into absolute silence. His storm-grey eyes met hers with the same shock of recognition she had felt in the market square, but stronger now, like lightning striking the same place twice. The bloodstone ring at his throat blazed briefly, so bright that several guests shielded their eyes, and Marta felt her own pendant grow warm against her skin. "May I join you?" he asked, his voice carrying clearly in the stillness. Every eye in the hall fixed upon them, nobles and merchants frozen with cups halfway to their lips, servants standing motionless with laden platters, even the minstrels holding their instruments, silent in their hands. The very air seemed to thicken with anticipation and dread. Marta's voice caught in her throat, but she managed a tiny nod. Lord Valen settled gracefully onto the rough wooden bench beside her, his presence transforming the humble table into something far more significant than its simple construction should have allowed. "Thank you," he said quietly, and something in his tone suggested he meant far more than gratitude for a place to sit. The great hall erupted in whispers. The whispers rose and fell like ocean waves against a distant shore, but Marta found herself strangely deaf to their venom. Lord Valen's presence beside her created a bubble of calm in the storm of village gossip, as if his very nearness muffled the cruel words that had haunted her for 20 years. She stared down at her hands, rough from years of herb gathering and potion brewing, and tried to understand why this pale stranger made her feel less alone than she had in decades. "You have beautiful hands," Valen said quietly, his voice pitched for her ears alone. "Healing hands. I remember them." Marta's head snapped up, meeting his storm-grey eyes with confusion and something deeper, a flutter of recognition that should have been impossible. "Remember them? But we've never met, my lord." A smile touched the corners of his mouth, sad and knowing. "Haven't we?" He reached into his dark doublet and withdrew a small crystal, no larger than a robin's egg, its surface smooth as polished glass, but clouded with an inner mist. "Perhaps this will help." The moonlit memory crystal pulsed with soft blue light as Valen's fingers closed around it. For a heartbeat, the great hall seemed to fade around them, the sounds of feast and gossip growing distant as whispers from another world. Then images flickered in the crystal's depths, shadows and moonlight, a young woman with gentle hands and frightened eyes, a man writhing in agony as something dark and terrible transformed his very soul. Marta gasped, her own hands flying to her throat, where the silver pendant grew suddenly warm. The vision lasted only seconds before Valen closed his fist around the crystal, but those brief moments had shaken something loose in the deepest corners of her memory. A night 30 years past, when she was barely 18 and her grandmother had been dead less than a month. A stranger collapsed outside her cottage, burning with fever and raving about curses and blood and eternal hunger. "The man in the forest," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the din of the feast. "You are dying. Or worse than dying." "Much worse," Valen confirmed, slipping the crystal back into his doublet. "You saved me that night, though I wonder if you truly understood what you were saving me from." Around them, the feast continued with forced normalcy. Baron Aldric had called for the first course to be served, and platters of roasted fowl began appearing on the long tables. But Marta noticed how the servants gave their table a wide berth, how conversations hushed when speakers realized they were within earshot of the strange pair in the corner. Elena Hartwell sat 3 tables away, her scarlet dress bright as a cardinal's feather, but her face had gone pale as winter frost. She kept stealing glances at Marta and Valen, her expression cycling through disbelief, fear, and something that might have been jealousy. Once, she started to rise from her seat as if to approach them, but her husband's firm hand on her wrist pulled her back down. "I don't remember clearly," Marta said, accepting a cup of ale from a nervous servant girl who spilled half the contents in her haste to retreat. Those months after grandmother died are like a fevered dream. I was trying so hard to fill her place, to heal everyone who came to my door, but I barely knew what I was doing. You knew enough, Valen replied, his own cup remaining untouched on the scarred wooden table. Your grandmother had taught you well, even if you didn't realize it at the time. The healing arts, the old words of power, the way to reach into a corrupted soul and draw out the poison that would otherwise consume it. Marta shivered despite the warmth of the great hall. Grandmother always said our family carried old debts and older promises. I thought she was speaking in riddles. Perhaps she was protecting you. Knowledge of such things can be dangerous for the unprepared. Valen's fingers traced the rim of his untouched cup, and Marta noticed how the ale inside remained perfectly still despite the motion. Tell me, do you still practice the healing arts? The question stung more than she expected. When I'm allowed to, she said bitterly, which is rarely these days. The village has decided I'm more witch than healer. Yet your garden still flourishes, doesn't it? Your herbs grow stronger than any natural plants should. Your very presence seems to draw the sick and wounded, even when they're too afraid to admit their need. Heat flushed Marta's cheeks. How could he possibly know such things? Her garden was hidden behind her cottage, visible only to the most persistent observers, and she had told no one about the way injured animals sought shelter in her yard, or how her healing plants seemed to respond to her emotions. "Who are you, really?" she asked, leaning closer to study his ageless features. "And don't tell me you're just some northern lord traveling for pleasure. Northern lords don't arrive alone in the dark of the moon, and they certainly don't carry crystals full of memories from 30 years past." Valen was quiet for a long moment, watching the feast swirl around them like a river flowing past an island. The minstrels had begun to play, their lutes and pipes weaving melodies that should have been cheerful, but somehow sounded melancholy in the cavernous space. Children darted between the tables, their laughter bright as silver bells, while their parents watched Lord Valen with expressions ranging from curiosity to outright hostility. "I am someone who has lived far longer than appearances suggest," he said finally. "Someone who owes you a debt that 30 years haven't diminished. Someone who recognized your particular gifts the moment I entered this village, just as I recognized them that night in the forest when you pulled me back from the very edge of damnation." The silver pendant at Marta's throat pulsed with warmth, as if responding to his words. She had worn it for so long that she barely noticed its weight, but now it felt alive against her skin, humming with an energy she didn't understand. "The pendant," Valen said, his eyes fixing on the gleaming silver. "May I see it?" Marta hesitated. The pendant had been her grandmother's, and her great-grandmother's before that, passed down through generations of healers. She had never let another soul touch it, sensing somehow that to do so would be to share something sacred and irreplaceable. But when Valen extended his hand, palm up in silent request, she found herself lifting the chain over her head without conscious decision. The moment the silver touched his skin, both pendant and bloodstone ring blazed with harmonious light, silver and crimson twining together like lovers reuniting after long separation. Several guests cried out in alarm at the sudden illumination, and Baron Aldric half rose from his chair at the head table. But the light faded quickly, leaving only the memory of impossible beauty and a lingering warmth that seemed to spread from the pendant through Marta's entire body. "Blessed by moonlight and tears," Valen murmured, studying the intricate knots carved into the silver's surface. made by hands that understood both healing and sacrifice. Your grandmother was a remarkable woman. You knew her? Not directly, but I know what this is, and what it represents. He handed the pendant back with reverent care. Your family line is older than you realize, Marta. The blood that flows in your veins carries gifts that most have forgotten ever existed. As she slipped the chain back over her head, Marta felt something shift inside her chest, a door opening after years of being locked, a river resuming its flow after a long drought. The pendant settled against her throat like a missing piece of herself, finally returned to its proper place. The pendant's renewed warmth spread through Marta's body like wine through water, awakening senses she had forgotten she possessed. The great hall suddenly felt different, not just visually, but in ways she couldn't name. She could sense the health of every person present, from Baron Aldric's mild arthritis to the kitchen maid's monthly pain, from the blacksmith's old shoulder injury to the worry eating at Elena's stomach like acid. "What's happening to me?" she whispered, pressing her hand to her chest, where the healing energy pooled like a warm spring. "You're remembering who you really are," Valen replied, his storm-grey eyes watching her with something that might have been pride. The gifts were never gone, Marta. They were simply sleeping, waiting for the right moment to wake. A child's cry from across the hall caught her attention, not the sound of play or minor hurt, but the deeper note of genuine distress. Little Annie Fletcher, Margaret's youngest, sat at her family's table clutching her stomach while her face grew pale as moonlight. The girl had been sickly since birth, prone to sudden attacks that left her writhing in pain while the local physician shook his head in helpless confusion. Without thinking, Marta half rose from her seat. The healing instincts that had driven her for decades surged to life, stronger than they had ever been. She could feel Annie's pain as if it were her own, a twisting knot of agony in a belly too small to contain such suffering. "Sit down, witch!" Elena's voice cut across the hall like a blade. Margaret Fletcher's former friend stood beside the child's table, her scarlet dress bright as fresh blood. "Stay away from that innocent girl." But Annie looked directly at Marta, with eyes that held far too much understanding for her 7 years. "Please," the child whispered, her voice carrying in the sudden hush that had fallen over nearby tables. "It hurts so much." The words broke something inside Marta's chest, not painful, but liberating, like ice cracking on a frozen river to let the water flow free. She walked across the hall with steady steps, ignoring the horrified gasps and protective gestures of parents pulling their own children closer. The silver pendant grew warmer with each step, pulsing in rhythm with her heartbeat. Margaret Fletcher moved to block Marta's path, her face twisted with fear and old resentment. "Get away from my daughter. Haven't you done enough harm to this family?" "Your daughter is dying," Marta said quietly, the words emerging with absolute certainty. "There's a growth in her belly, something that shouldn't be there. It's been growing for months, and it will kill her before the spring if someone doesn't help her." Margaret's face went white. The local physician had told her Annie's pain was merely childish fancy, that girls sometimes invented ailments to gain attention. But Marta's words carried the weight of diagnosis, spoken with the authority of someone who could see illness the way others saw color. "Let her help," came a small voice from behind Margaret. Father Benedict stood near the wall, his weathered hands clasped before him. The priest's face showed the strain of internal struggle, faith warring with compassion, doctrine battling with the evidence of his own eyes. "I have watched this child suffer for months. If there is healing to be had, we should not turn it away." Marta knelt beside Annie's chair, her hands hovering over the girl's small form. The healing energy flowed from the pendant through her body and into her palms, warm and bright as captured sunlight. She had performed similar diagnoses countless times in her youth, but never had the gift felt so strong, so certain. "May I?" she asked, looking up at Margaret with eyes that held only compassion. The mother looked between her suffering daughter and the woman she had spent 5 years teaching her children to fear. Annie's pain won the battle. Margaret stepped aside with a jerky nod, tears already streaming down her cheeks. Marta's hands settled gently on Annie's stomach, and immediately she could feel the wrongness nestled beneath the child's ribs, a mass of twisted flesh that grew larger each day, pressing against organs that had no room to accommodate its presence. But she could also feel something else, something that made her healing senses sing with recognition. The child carried a trace of the old blood. It was faint, diluted by generations of marriages to ordinary folk, but it was there, the same bloodline that flowed in Marta's own veins, the same gifts that had marked her family as healers and guardians for centuries uncounted. Annie's suffering wasn't just random illness. It was the price of awakening power with no one to guide or teach her. "Close your eyes, little one," Marta murmured, her voice taking on the lilting cadence her grandmother had used for healing songs. "Think of sunlight on water, of flowers opening in spring rain, of all the bright and beautiful things that make you smile." The healing energy poured from Marta's hands into the child's body, seeking out the twisted growth and surrounding it with warmth and light. She had performed similar healings before, but never with such power, never with such absolute certainty that she could unmake what illness had wrought. The growth began to shrink under the assault of pure healing force, its corrupted cells unable to withstand the cleansing energy that flowed through Annie's small frame. But more than that, Marta felt the child's dormant gifts stirring to life, the healing bloodline remembering its purpose and claiming its birthright. Around them, the great hall had fallen into absolute silence. Even the minstrels had stopped playing, their instruments hanging forgotten in their hands as they watched the impossible unfold before their eyes. Some guests crossed themselves and muttered prayers, while others simply stared in awe at the soft glow that seemed to emanate from Marta's hands. When the healing was complete, Annie sat up with a gasp of pure relief. The pain that had haunted her for months was gone, replaced by a sense of wholeness and vitality that made her eyes shine like stars. She threw her small arms around Marta's neck, pressing her face against the silver pendant that still hummed with residual energy. "Thank you," the child whispered. "I can feel the light now. It's warm and happy and it wants to help people." Margaret Fletcher collapsed into her chair, sobbing with relief and gratitude, and something that might have been shame. Around the hall, whispers began again, but these carried wonder instead of fear, amazement instead of suspicion. Lord Valen appeared at Marta's side, his pale hand settling gently on her shoulder. "Well done," he said quietly, his voice warm with approval. "Your grandmother would be proud." But even as the immediate crisis passed, Marta could feel new tensions building in the great hall. Baron Aldric watched from the head table with calculating eyes, while Eleanor Hartwell's face cycled through expressions of awe, jealousy, and something darker. The healing had revealed Marta's true gifts to everyone present, but revelation was a double-edged sword that could cut the wielder as easily as her enemies. Father Benedict approached slowly, his weathered face a map of conflicted emotions. "Child," he said to Marta, his voice barely above a whisper, We need to talk." The walk to Father Benedict's private chambers felt like a journey through a world transformed. Servants and guests alike stepped aside as Marta passed, their expressions ranging from reverent awe to barely concealed fear. The healing of Annie Fletcher had shattered 20 years of carefully constructed mythology about the village witch, replacing whispered rumors with witnessed miracle. Lord Valen walked beside her, his presence a steady anchor in the storm of attention. Behind them, the great hall buzzed with excited conversation as feast-goers struggled to process what they had seen. Some praised God for the miracle, others crossed themselves against witchcraft, but none could deny the evidence of their own eyes. Father Benedict's chambers occupied a small tower room above the chapel, reached by narrow stone steps, worn smooth by centuries of pilgrims' feet. The priest moved slowly ahead of them, his weathered hands trembling slightly as he fumbled with the heavy iron key. Whether from age or emotion, Marta couldn't say. "Sit, please." Benedict gestured to simple wooden chairs arranged around a small table. Candlelight flickered across shelves lined with religious texts and illuminated manuscripts, while a small fire crackled in the stone hearth. The room felt peaceful, sacred, far removed from the chaos of revelations that swirled through the manor below. Valen settled gracefully into his chair, but his attention seemed focused not on their host, but on a particular object displayed on the priest's desk, an ornate silver chalice set with precious stones that caught the firelight like captured stars. "Beautiful workmanship," Valen observed, his voice carefully neutral. "May I?" Father Benedict nodded absently, still struggling with his own internal conflicts. A gift from Baron Aldric's family, passed down through generations. They say it once belonged to a great lord who fought against. His words died as Valen's fingers touched the chalice's stem. The moment skin met silver, the chalice blazed with malevolent red light. Not the warm crimson of healing energy, but something darker, hungrier, stained with old blood and older hatred. Valen jerked his hand back as if burned, while the priest stumbled backward with a cry of alarm. "Where did you get this?" Valen's voice carried an edge of steel that made the candle frames shiver. "I told you, it's been in the Baron's family for—" "I know exactly how long it's been in his family," Valen interrupted, rising from his chair with predatory grace. "I know because it was stolen from my father's hall 700 years ago, when Baron Aldric's ancestors rode with the vampire hunters who slaughtered my entire household." The words hung in the air like sword blades, sharp and deadly. Marta felt her healing senses recoil from the waves of ancient pain and rage that rolled off Valen's normally controlled form. The bloodstone ring at his throat blazed in response to the cursed chalice, two artifacts of power recognizing each other across the centuries. 700 years, Father Benedict repeated faintly. "But that would make you very old and very patient and very interested in finally reclaiming what was taken from my family." Valen's storm-grey eyes fixed on the priest with uncomfortable intensity. "Tell me, Father, what stories does the Baron's family tell about their glorious ancestor, the heroic crusader who cleansed the land of supernatural evil?" Benedict sank into his chair, his weathered face pale as parchment. "Sir Aldric the Purifier. He led a company of knights against a vampire lord who had terrorized the northern provinces. The family still celebrates his victory every year on the Feast of St. Michael." "Sir Aldric the Butcher would be more accurate," Valen said bitterly. "He and his knights didn't just hunt vampires, they slaughtered anyone they suspected of supernatural abilities. Healers, wise women, even children who showed unusual gifts. My father tried to negotiate peace, offered to withdraw from all human settlements if they would simply leave us in peace. Sir Aldric's response was to attack during the parley under a flag of truce. Marta reached out instinctively, her hand finding Valen's arm. The moment her healing energy touched him, some of the rage seemed to drain from his posture. "Is that how you were cursed?" I was 23 years old, barely more than a boy, when my father sent me to oversee our family's northern holdings. The curse was meant for him, a vampiric corruption that would destroy his soul and turn him into the very monster Sir Aldric claimed he already was. But I was there instead, and young enough to survive the transformation, where an older man would have died outright. The cursed chalice continued to pulse with malevolent light, its presence making the sacred space feel polluted and wrong. Father Benedict stared at it, with growing horror, understanding dawning in his eyes. "The Baron knows," he whispered, "about what you are, about why you're really here. This isn't coincidence." "No," Valen agreed grimly. "Baron Aldric invited me to this feast knowing exactly who I am and what his family owes mine. The question is whether he means to finish what his ancestor started or finally make amends for 7 centuries of injustice." Marta felt pieces of a vast puzzle clicking together in her mind. My family, the old debts and older promises my grandmother spoke of. We're connected to this somehow, aren't we? Valen nodded slowly. Your bloodline carries the gift of soul healing, the ability to cleanse corruption from those who have been tainted by dark magic. It's incredibly rare, so precious that vampire lords of old would protect entire villages just to ensure a soul healer remained available when needed. My father had such an arrangement with your great-grandmother. "Protection in exchange for healing," Marta breathed. "That's why my family stayed in Ravenscroft all these generations. We weren't just village healers. We were bound to help supernatural beings who needed salvation. Until Sir Aldric and his vampire hunters broke that ancient compact with blood and fire." Valen's fingers traced the bloodstone ring at his throat. "Your great-grandmother barely escaped the massacre. She fled south with her infant daughter, hiding among ordinary humans while her magical gifts slowly faded from disuse." Father Benedict looked between them with growing alarm. "And now the Baron's descendant hosts a feast where the vampire lord meets the soul healer's heir. This cannot be coincidence." Heavy footsteps on the stone stairs announced an approaching presence. All 3 turned toward the door as it swung open without ceremony, revealing Baron Aldric himself, flanked by 2 armed guards. The Baron wore full ceremonial armor over his feast clothes, its polished surface reflecting the cursed chalice's crimson glow. "Indeed, it is not coincidence, good father," Aldric said, his hand resting casually on his sword hilt. "Lord Valen, Lady Marta, I believe it's time we discussed the real reason you're both here." Behind the Baron's confident smile lay something cold and calculating, something that reminded Marta uncomfortably of a cat that had finally cornered particularly interesting prey. The cursed chalice pulsed brighter, as if feeding on the tension that filled the small chamber, like smoke from a poisonous fire. The ancient blood debt was about to come due, one way or another. Baron Aldric's armor gleamed in the candlelight like polished bone, each piece bearing intricate engravings that hurt to look at directly. Marta's healing senses recoiled from the symbols etched into the metal, not mere decoration, but wards designed specifically to repel supernatural influence. The Baron had not merely donned ceremonial garb, he had prepared for war. 7 centuries is a long time to hold a grudge, Aldric said, conversationally, though his hand never left his sword hilt. But the Aldric family has never forgotten our sacred duty to protect humanity from the creatures that prey upon it. Your ancestor murdered innocents under a flag of truce, Valen replied, his voice deadly calm. Women and children who had never harmed a living soul. Collateral damage in a righteous cause. The Baron's smile held no warmth, though I admit, killing the soul healer was an error. My family has spent generations trying to locate her bloodline, to finish what Sir Aldric began. Marta felt ice form in her veins. You've been hunting my family. Not hunting, precisely. Watching, waiting. Your great-grandmother hid well among the common folk, and her daughter was even more careful to suppress her gifts. But power has a way of revealing itself eventually. Aldric's gaze fixed on her with predatory intensity. Your grandmother's healing abilities were too strong to hide completely. We knew the bloodline survived. Father Benedict rose from his chair, his weathered face flushed with righteous anger. Baron, this is madness. Marta has done nothing but good for this village. Her healing has saved countless lives. Her healing has preserved a bloodline that should have ended centuries ago, Aldric snapped. Do you think it coincidence that vampire lords once protected settlements containing soul healers? They weren't being charitable, priest. They were ensuring their own salvation should they ever require it. The cursed chalice pulsed brighter, its malevolent energy seeming to feed on the rising tension in the chamber. Marta could feel its corrupt influence pressing against her consciousness like oil on water, seeking to taint her healing abilities with something darker and more selfish. You don't understand, she said, backing away from the artifact's poisonous glow. The healing gift isn't meant for personal gain. It's about balance, about helping those who, about giving monsters a way to escape the consequences of their nature, Aldric interrupted. Your ancestor made a devil's bargain, trading her services to creatures of darkness in exchange for protection. That compact died with my ancestor's righteous blade. But even as the Baron spoke, Marta felt something stirring deep within her cottage, a presence she had almost forgotten, something that had slumbered beneath her floorboards for decades. The sacred oak staff, carved from the village's ancient protection tree, was calling to her across the distance. Her grandmother had hidden it before her death, claiming Marta wasn't ready for such responsibility. Now, with the cursed chalice corrupting the very air around them, the staff's power awakened in response to its opposite. Light called to light, protection to protection, healing to healing. The old compact was broken by treachery, Valen said, moving subtly to place himself between Marta and the Baron's guards. But the bloodline debt remains. Your family owes mine 7 centuries of justice. My family owes yours nothing, Aldric snarled. We are the righteous ones, the protectors of humanity against supernatural predation. If you want justice, monster, you'll find it at the end of my blade. The Baron's sword cleared its sheath with a whisper of steel, its blade etched with the same painful symbols that adorned his armor. But before he could advance, Marta stepped forward, power flowing through her in ways she had never experienced. "Stop!" she commanded, and her voice carried the authority of generations. There has been enough bloodshed over this ancient wrong. The sacred oak staff materialized in her hands, as if summoned by sheer necessity, its gnarled wood warm with protective energy. The moment her fingers closed around it, Marta felt her healing abilities amplify beyond anything she had ever imagined. She could sense every living thing within miles, the feast guests below, the animals in the forest beyond, even the plants sleeping through winter in her garden. More than that, she could feel the true nature of the forces arrayed around her. Baron Aldric's righteousness was genuine, but twisted by centuries of inherited hatred. Valen's pain ran soul deep, but his desire for vengeance had not yet corrupted his essential nobility. Father Benedict struggled with the collision between doctrine and compassion, while the cursed chalice whispered promises of power to anyone willing to embrace its corruption. "You are the village protector now," Valen said quietly, recognizing what had just occurred. "The role your bloodline was born to fulfill. A protector serves all who need protection," Marta replied, the staff's power flowing through her words like honey through water. "Human and supernatural alike, when they come in peace." Baron Aldric's face contorted with rage. "You would defend a vampire, a creature that feeds on human blood. I would defend someone who has spent 30 years trying to repay a kindness shown to him in his darkest hour," Marta said firmly. "And I would protect my people from those who would harm them in the name of righteousness." The cursed chalice flared brighter, its influence reaching toward the sacred staff like grasping fingers. But where the two powers met, light triumphed over darkness, healing over corruption, love over hatred. The Baron stumbled backward as his artifact's malevolent energy was turned back upon itself. Outside the tower window, the village of Ravenscroft spread below them, like a map of lives that needed protection. But Marta could sense other presences approaching through the darkness, supernatural beings drawn by the collision of ancient powers, some curious, others hostile. The delicate balance that had kept the village safe for centuries was crumbling. "They're coming," Valen said, his enhanced senses detecting what Marta's staff revealed to her. "My kind, drawn by the scent of conflict and old magic. Some seek justice, others merely hunger for chaos." "Then we make our stand here," Marta declared, the oak staff humming with protective energy. "This is my home, my responsibility. I will not let innocent people suffer for crimes committed centuries before their birth." Baron Aldric raised his sword again, but hesitation flickered across his features. He had expected to face a frightened village healer and a single vampire. Instead, he confronted a soul healer who had claimed her full birthright, backed by power that made his cursed artifacts seem pale and weak by comparison. "Choose carefully, Baron," Father Benedict said, quietly. "Some sins are too great for even righteous intentions to justify." The sound of hoofbeats echoed through the night air. Riders approaching the village at supernatural speed, their presence making the very stones of the tower tremble with anticipation. The ancient debt was about to be settled, but the price might be higher than any of them had imagined. The hoofbeats grew louder, accompanied by sounds that made the night air itself seem to recoil. The whisper of wings too large for any natural bird, the howl of voices that had forgotten how to be human. Through the tower window, dark shapes moved against the star-scattered sky, approaching Ravenscroft with predatory intent. "How many?" Marta asked, the sacred oak staff trembling in her hands as her enhanced senses struggled to count the supernatural presences converging on their peaceful village. "Too many," Valen replied grimly. "Word spreads quickly among our kind when ancient powers stir. They smell opportunity in the chaos." Baron Aldric's cursed sword gleamed in the candlelight as he moved toward the window. "This is what happens when you harbor monsters, priest. They draw others of their kind, like carrion draws vultures." "And whose fault is that?" Father Benedict demanded, his usual gentle demeanor cracking under the strain. "You orchestrated this confrontation, Baron. You invited both of them here, knowing what would result." But Marta barely heard their argument. The oak staff in her hands was pulling her attention elsewhere, its ancient power resonating with something hidden in the priest's chambers. Her gaze fell upon a small hand mirror propped on a shelf of religious texts, its silvered surface seeming to pulse with the same rhythm as her heartbeat. The mirror, she whispered, moving toward it despite Valen's restraining hand on her arm. There's something. The moment her reflection appeared in the soul-bound glass, everything changed. The woman staring back at her was familiar, yet alien, her features recognizable but somehow more than they should be. Her eyes held depths that spoke of centuries rather than decades, while her skin carried a luminescence that belonged to moonlight rather than mortal flesh. Most shocking of all, delicate lines of silver traced her face and hands, not wrinkles of age, but intricate patterns that marked her as something far removed from ordinary humanity. No, she breathed, stepping back from the mirror's revelations. That's not possible. But the soul-bound glass showed truth, and the truth was undeniable. Marta was not simply a descendant of an ancient bloodline of healers. She was something far rarer, far more powerful, and far more dangerous to those who would exploit her gifts. You knew, she accused, spinning to face Valen with the staff raised between them like a barrier. You've known all along what I am. Valen's expression held sorrow rather than guilt. I suspected. The healing you performed on me 30 years ago was too perfect, too complete. Only a true soul healer could have cleansed the vampiric curse so thoroughly. But I hoped— What is she? Baron Aldric demanded, his voice sharp with new alarm. The cursed chalice at Father Benedict's desk blazed brighter, as if feeding on the revelation unfolding before them. Marta looked down at her hands, seeing them now as the mirror had shown, traced with silver patterns that pulsed with their own inner light. The sacred oak staff felt different in her grip, not a tool she wielded, but an extension of her own essence. Everything made sense now. Her impossible garden, the way injured animals sought her out, her ability to heal ailments that should have been beyond any mortal's power. I'm not human, she said quietly, the words falling into the chamber like stones into still water. Not entirely. The bloodline my grandmother spoke of, it wasn't just magical ability passed down through human generations. It was something else entirely, something that chose to take human form to better serve its purpose. A guardian spirit, Father Benedict whispered, his theological training providing the proper term, even as his faith struggled to accept it. Bound to the mortal realm through choice rather than birth. More than that, Valen added, his storm-grey eyes fixed on Marta's transformed reflection. Soul healers aren't just spirits, they're fragments of something divine, sent to maintain the balance between light and darkness. They can purify any corruption, heal any wound, but only at great personal cost. The sound of breaking glass echoed from below as something shattered the great hall's windows. Screams rose from the feast guests as supernatural predators descended upon the manor, drawn by the revelation of Marta's true nature. A soul healer was the greatest prize any vampire lord could claim, not for consumption, but for the promise of eternal salvation their touch could provide. They'll tear the village apart to reach her, Valen said, moving to the window to assess the assault below. My former allies show no mercy when divine power is within their grasp. Baron Aldric's face had gone pale as understanding dawned. Sir Aldric the Purifier didn't just hunt vampires. He hunted guardian spirits, divine beings, sent to protect humanity. Marta, ancestor committed deicide. The cursed chalice cracked under the weight of this revelation, its malevolent power unable to withstand proximity to a being of such pure purpose. 7 centuries of inherited guilt crashed down upon the Baron's shoulders as he realized the magnitude of his family's sin. The compact, Marta said, pieces falling together in her mind like a puzzle completing itself. It wasn't just an agreement between my ancestor and Valen's family. It was a divine mandate, a sacred duty to maintain balance between supernatural and human worlds, which my ancestor broke with blood and betrayal, Aldric finished, his sword clattering to the floor as strength fled his limbs. We've spent 7 centuries hunting the very being sent to protect us. Through the window, the supernatural assault on Ravenscroft intensified. Vampire lords led packs of lesser creatures through the streets, while dark-winged beings circled overhead like carrion birds. The village guards fought bravely but uselessly against foes that laughed at mortal weapons. "I have to go to them," Marta said, turning toward the door. "This is what I was made for. To protect, to heal, to stand between the innocent and those who would prey upon them." "It's suicide," Valen protested. "There are too many, and they know what you are now. They won't show restraint." "Then help me," she replied, the silver patterns on her skin blazing brighter as her divine nature fully awakened. "Honor the original compact. Stand with me as your father once stood with my predecessor." The sacred oak staff hummed with building power as Marta claimed her full inheritance. She was no longer the village outcast, the fallen healer scorned by those she had served. She was what she had always been, a guardian spirit wearing mortal form, sent to maintain the delicate balance that kept both worlds safe. But with revelation came terrible responsibility. Every choice she made now would echo through generations. Every life saved or lost would weigh upon a soul that was older and more fragile than mortal minds could comprehend. "The unity chalice," she said suddenly, pointing to a small silver cup that had been hidden behind the cursed artifact. "That's how we end this, not with violence, but with willing sacrifice." Father Benedict followed her gaze, his eyes widening as he recognized the pure silver vessel. Unlike the Baron's corrupted chalice, this cup radiated gentle warmth, its surface unmarked by the symbols of hatred and fear. "The choice," Valen breathed, understanding dawning in his ancient eyes. "Between preserving yourself and saving everyone else. It's the test every soul healer must eventually face." Outside, the screams grew louder as supernatural predators closed in on their ultimate prize. But inside the tower chamber, 4 souls stood at the crossroads of destiny, each carrying the weight of ancient choices and the hope of redemption. The real battle was about to begin, not between armies, but between the forces of sacrifice and selfishness, love and fear, salvation and damnation. And at its center stood a woman who had just discovered she was so much more than human, facing a choice that would determine the fate of every living thing in Ravenscroft. The silver patterns on her skin pulsed brighter as she reached for the unity chalice, knowing that what she chose next would echo through eternity. The unity chalice felt heavier than silver should, as Marta lifted it from Father Benedict's shelf, its pure metal warm against her transformed hands. The silver patterns tracing her skin pulsed in harmony with the cup's gentle radiance, recognizing kindred purpose. Through the tower window, supernatural chaos consumed Ravenscroft like wildfire through dry wheat. "Tell me what it means," she said quietly, though part of her already knew. Divine knowledge flowed through her awakened consciousness like water through a broken dam, revealing truths that her mortal mind had never been meant to hold. Valen's ancient eyes reflected centuries of pain and hope intertwined. The unity chalice accepts the willing sacrifice of one's deepest essence, not death, but something far more profound. A soul healer who drinks from it can cleanse any corruption, heal any wound, restore any balance. But the cost is everything I am, Marta finished, understanding flooding through her like cold mountain water. To save them all, I have to give up my divine nature, become truly mortal, truly vulnerable. More than that, Father Benedict added softly, his theological training providing context for the impossible. You would retain your memories but lose your power, your connection to the divine realm that sent you here. You would become what you have pretended to be. A simple village healer, with no gifts beyond knowledge and compassion. Below them, the sounds of battle grew more intense. Through the shattered windows of the great hall, Elena's voice rose in desperate command as she organized the evacuation of children and elderly villagers. The woman who had spent 5 years mocking Marta was now risking her own life to protect others, proving that heroism often emerged from the most unexpected sources. Baron Aldric knelt beside his cursed chalice, which had cracked beyond repair when Marta's true nature was revealed. 7 centuries of inherited hatred warred with the growing realization that his family had been fundamentally wrong about everything they believed. His hands shook as he traced the corrupt symbols etched into his armor. "There has to be another way," he said desperately. "Some path that doesn't require such sacrifice." "Sacrifice freely given is the only currency that matters in battles between light and darkness," Marta replied, the sacred oak staff humming with agreement in her hands. "Force creates only more force. Fear breeds only more fear. But love given without condition or expectation, that can transform anything." A thunderous crash shook the tower as something massive struck the manor's outer walls. Through the window, Marta could see the leader of the vampire assault, an ancient creature whose presence made the very air seem to thicken with malevolence. Lord Cassian, Valen had called him during their whispered strategy session, a vampire so old that he had been ancient when Rome was young, his power drawn from centuries of accumulated darkness. "He was my father's greatest rival," Valen explained, watching Cassian's forces systematically overwhelm the village defenses. "When Sir Aldric's vampire hunters destroyed our family, Cassian claimed our territories and our followers. He spent centuries building power, waiting for an opportunity like this. A divine soul healer under his control would make him unstoppable," Father Benedict said grimly. "He could cleanse his own corruption while retaining his vampiric abilities, becoming something truly monstrous." But Marta's attention was drawn to smaller details visible through the chaos below. Annie Fletcher clutched her mother's hand as they ran toward the church, the child's newly awakened healing gifts, creating a faint golden aura around them both. Other villagers she had secretly helped over the years moved with purpose rather than panic, their bodies strengthened by her touch, even when their minds had forgotten her kindness. "They remember," she whispered, hope blooming in her chest like spring flowers breaking through winter snow. "Not consciously, but their bodies remember my healing. They're stronger because of what I've given them." Elena appeared at the church doors, her scarlet dress torn and stained, but her voice still carrying clear commands. She had positioned herself between the supernatural attackers and the most vulnerable villagers, armed with nothing but fierce determination and an iron poker from the chapel's fireplace. "Elena," Marta breathed, seeing her former friend's courage with new eyes. "She's protecting them because she knows they're worth protecting, not because she believes in my power." "Love takes many forms," Valen observed, his own gaze following hers. "The love that drives her to shield others from harm, the love that brought me back to repay an old debt, the love that led you to heal even those who scorned you. These are all threads in the same tapestry. The unity chalice grew warmer in Marta's hands, as if responding to their words. Its silver surface began to show reflections that had nothing to do with the candle-lit chamber around them. Instead, she saw moments of connection, spanning decades, every life she had saved, every pain she had eased, every family kept whole by her intervention. "I understand now," she said softly. "The power was never really mine. I was just the vessel, the hands through which divine love could work. But they—" She gestured toward the window, toward the villagers fighting desperately below. "They learned to love by watching love in action. That's the real gift, the one that doesn't require magic or divine nature to sustain." Baron Aldric rose from beside his broken chalice, his movements heavy with the weight of generations. "My ancestor destroyed the compact through fear and hatred. Perhaps it falls to me to restore it through understanding and sacrifice." He began removing his cursed armor, piece by piece, each segment clattering to the stone floor like chains being broken. Underneath, he wore simple clothes that made him appear far younger and more vulnerable than his lordly bearing had suggested. "I offer myself as surety," he said formally, kneeling before Marta. "My life as guarantee that my family will honor the ancient compact from this day forward. Use my death, if necessary, to power the ritual. It might be justice, after all these centuries." "Death is not what's needed," Marta replied, helping him to his feet. "Understanding is. Acceptance. The willingness to defend what is right, regardless of what form it takes." Through the window, Valen's enhanced senses tracked the approaching supernatural army. "Cassian has broken through the outer defenses. His forces will reach the manor within minutes." "Then it's time," Marta said, raising the unity chalice toward the candlelight. Its silver surface caught and held the flame, transforming mere illumination into something that hurt to look at directly. "Father, I'll need you to bear witness. Baron, I'll need your word that the compact will be honored. And Valen—" She turned to face him, seeing past his vampire nature to the noble soul beneath. "I need you to live, to remember not just tonight, but everything that led to it. The choices that brought us here, the love that made them possible, the hope that survives, even when power fails." Valen's composure cracked, revealing depths of emotion that centuries of existence had not diminished. "There has to be another way. I cannot bear to lose you again. Not when I've finally found you." "You're not losing me," she said gently, reaching out to touch his face with fingers that glowed like starlight. "Love doesn't end when power fades. If anything, it becomes purer, more real, more precious, because it exists without supernatural enhancement." The sound of splintering wood echoed from below as Cassian's forces breached the manor's main entrance. Inhuman voices raised in triumph, while human screams of terror provided a horrifying counterpoint. Time was running out for everyone in Ravenscroft. "I have to go to them now," Marta said, the unity chalice pulsing with building power. "The ritual must be completed where the need is greatest, among the people I'm sworn to protect." She moved toward the door, but Valen caught her hand, his fingers intertwining with hers in a gesture that spoke of partnership rather than possession. "Then we go together. Whatever comes, we face it side by side." Father Benedict gathered his ceremonial vestments, preparing to perform a ritual that existed in no religious text, but felt more sacred than anything in his long ministry. Baron Aldric retrieved a simple sword from the wall, its plain steel somehow more honorable than the cursed blade he had abandoned. As they prepared to descend into the chaos below, Marta felt the weight of eternity pressing against her mortal consciousness. Every choice that had led to this moment, every life that hung in the balance, every future that depended on what happened next, all of it focused down to this single point of decision. The unity chalice blazed brighter as they opened the door, its light pushing back shadows that seemed to have physical weight. Whatever waited below in the burning village, they would meet it together. Divine and mortal, noble and common, united by bonds stronger than any magic. The final confrontation was about to begin. The great hall had become a battlefield, painted in shadows and flame. Overturned tables formed barricades where desperate villagers made their stand against supernatural predators, while the harvest feast decorations burned like funeral pyres around them. Lord Cassian stood in the center of the chaos, his ancient presence making the very air thick with malevolence. Marta descended the stone steps with the unity chalice blazing in her hands, its pure light cutting through the darkness like a sword made of starlight. Behind her, Valen moved with deadly grace. Baron Aldric gripped his simple steel sword, and Father Benedict clutched his holy symbols with hands that trembled but held firm. "The divine soul healer reveals herself at last," Cassian called out, his voice carrying the weight of millennia. His pale face held the terrible beauty of a marble statue, perfect and utterly cold. "How fitting that you should come to me willingly." Around him, lesser vampires and dark creatures paused in their assault, turning hungry eyes toward Marta. She could feel their desperate craving like a physical force, not for her blood, but for the salvation her touch could provide. Each of them had been corrupted by darkness, transformed into something monstrous against their will, and her divine nature promised the redemption they had sought for centuries. "I offer you a choice," Marta said, her voice carrying clearly through the hall despite the surrounding chaos. "Withdraw from this place and harm no one, and I will heal any among you who truly seeks purification." Cassian's laughter was like ice breaking on a winter river. "You think to bargain with me, little goddess? I have waited 700 years for this opportunity. Your predecessor escaped Sir Aldric's blade, but she died eventually, as all mortals do. You, however, with your divine essence claimed and bound to my will, could provide eternal salvation to my chosen few while ensuring my own power remains absolute." Elena's voice rose from behind an overturned table where she sheltered a group of children. "She's not some prize to be claimed, monster. She's our healer, our protector." The woman who had spent years mocking Marta now defended her with fierce determination, wielding an iron poker like a warrior's spear. Around her, other villagers who had once whispered cruel rumors about the village witch now stood ready to defend her with their lives. "How touching," Cassian sneered, gesturing to his followers. "Kill the mortals, take the healer alive." But as the vampire horde surged forward, Marta raised the unity chalice high above her head. The silver cup blazed with light so pure it made Cassian's creatures recoil, their corrupted forms unable to withstand proximity to such divine radiance. "I call upon the bonds of eternity," Marta began, her voice taking on the resonance of divine authority. Ethereal chains of light began to appear in the air around her, visible only to those with supernatural sight. The bonds that connected all living things, the threads of love and sacrifice that held the world together, became manifest in response to her words. Valen saw them first, his vampire nature allowing him to perceive the luminous connections that linked every soul in the great hall. Chains of silver light bound parent to child, friend to friend, protector to protected. But strongest of all were the bonds between Marta and every person she had ever healed, every life she had touched with compassion. "The bonds of eternity," he whispered in recognition. "The connections that make willing sacrifice possible." Cassian's perfect features twisted with rage as he realized what was happening. "Stop her! She cannot be allowed to complete the ritual." But his creatures found themselves unable to advance. The light from the Unity Chalice created a barrier they could not cross, while the ethereal bonds connecting Marta to the villagers formed a web of protection that supernatural malevolence could not penetrate. Baron Aldric stepped forward, his simple sword raised not in threat but in salute. "By my bloodline's oath, I pledge my house to the ancient compact. Let the sins of my ancestor be cleansed through willing service to the divine protector." His words carried the weight of formal ceremony, and Marta felt something shift in the cosmic balance that governed such things. 7 centuries of inherited guilt began to lift from the Baron's shoulders as he chose redemption over revenge. Father Benedict approached with his ceremonial vestments, his weathered hands steady now despite the chaos around them. "By the authority invested in me by divine grace, I witness this sacrifice freely given. Let all who hear bear testimony to love triumphant over darkness." The Unity Chalice grew heavier in Marta's hands as it began to fill with liquid light. Not wine or water, but pure essence distilled from willing sacrifice. The silver cup accepted her offering as she prepared to surrender everything that made her more than mortal. But Valen caught her hand before she could drink, his storm-grey eyes reflecting centuries of pain and newfound hope. "Wait. If you do this, if you become truly mortal, then I'll need someone to protect me," she finished gently. "Someone who understands the true meaning of the compact our families once shared." Around them, the bonds of eternity pulsed brighter as the ritual reached its crucial moment. Every choice that had led to this instant, every act of love or cruelty, every sacrifice made or refused, all of it crystallized into this single point of transformation. Cassian's roar of fury shook the very foundations of the manor, but he remained helpless to intervene as divine will made itself manifest in the mortal realm. Marta lifted the Unity Chalice to her lips, the liquid light within swirling like captured starlight. The moment had come for the ultimate choice, to save everyone she loved by sacrificing everything she was. Around her, the bonds of eternity pulsed with increasing brilliance, connecting every soul in the great hall through threads of love and shared purpose. "Wait!" Annie Fletcher's small voice cut through the chaos. The child had broken free from her mother's protective embrace, and now stood at the edge of the light barrier surrounding Marta. "You don't have to do this alone." The girl's newly awakened healing gifts blazed to life, her small hands glowing with the same silver radiance that marked Marta's divine nature. But Annie's power was different, younger, more flexible, untainted by years of hiding and suppression. "The bloodline," Marta breathed, understanding dawning like sunrise. "It doesn't end with me." Other figures stepped forward from among the villagers. People Marta had healed over the years, their bodies carrying traces of her divine touch. They couldn't wield her power, but they could share her burden. Each person she had saved carried a fragment of healing light, and now that light answered her call. Margaret Fletcher reached her daughter's side, tears streaming down her face. "Whatever you need, take it. You gave me back my child. Let me help save yours." One by one, others joined them. Eleanor stepped through the barrier, her scarlet dress torn, but her spirit unbroken. Timothy Fletcher, the boy whose lung fever Marta had cured years ago. Marcus the blacksmith, his old injuries forgotten in the face of divine purpose. Even some who had mocked her found courage in the moment that mattered most. "I understand now," Marta said, the unity chalice trembling in her hands. "The heart of compassion. It was never about my power alone. It was about what that power awakened in others." A golden ember began to glow in her chest, visible through her skin like a miniature sun. The heart of compassion, the source of her divine nature, pulsed with warm light that reached out to touch every soul willing to receive it. Cassian saw what was happening and roared in fury. "You cannot multiply the divine essence. It belongs to me by right of conquest." But Valen stepped between the ancient vampire and his prize, his own transformation beginning. "The compact was never about ownership," he said, his voice carrying new authority. "It was about partnership, and I choose mortality over monstrosity." As he spoke, the bloodstone ring at his throat cracked and shattered, releasing centuries of accumulated vampire essence. But instead of dissipating, that dark energy flowed toward the unity chalice, where Marta's divine light transformed it into something pure and redemptive. The change in Valen was immediate and profound. His pale skin warmed with human color, his storm-gray eyes brightened with mortal hope, and his ancient weariness lifted like mist before sunrise. He was choosing to become what he had been before the curse, a young man capable of love, growth, and eventual death. "Together," Marta said, offering him the chalice, "as it should have been from the beginning." They drank together, sharing the liquid light between them. The divine essence flowed through both their bodies, but instead of diminishing Marta's power, it transformed it. The raw divinity that had set her apart from humanity became something more personal, more connected to the mortal realm she had chosen to protect. The heart of compassion in her chest blazed brighter, sending waves of healing energy throughout the great hall. Every person touched by that light, villager and vampire alike, felt their deepest wounds beginning to heal. Not just physical injuries, but the spiritual corruption that had poisoned relationships and twisted souls toward darkness. Eleanor gasped as years of jealousy and resentment dissolved, replaced by the warm memory of friendship that had existed before. Fear drove them apart. Baron Aldric felt the weight of inherited hatred lift from his shoulders as understanding replaced the desire for vengeance. Father Benedict experienced a deepening of faith that transcended doctrine and embraced the radical power of divine love. But the transformation's greatest effect was on Cassian's vampire horde. Faced with genuine redemption offered freely rather than salvation seized by force, many began to remember what they had been before corruption claimed them. Some fell to their knees, weeping with relief as their monstrous nature cracked and fell away like broken chains. Cassian himself stood frozen in the center of the hall, his perfect features contorting with rage and something that might have been fear. "This is impossible. Divine essence cannot be shared. It diminishes with division." "Love doesn't follow the rules of mathematics," Marta replied, her voice now carrying both divine authority and mortal warmth. "The more it's shared, the stronger it becomes." The unity chalice shattered in her hands, its purpose fulfilled, but the light it had contained spread throughout the great hall like dawn breaking over the world. The bonds of eternity became visible to every eye, revealing the invisible connections that bound all living things together in a web of interdependence and care. Cassian's form began to waver as the transformed energy in the hall worked against his ancient corruption. "You have doomed yourself, little goddess. Without your full divine nature, You are vulnerable to every mortal frailty." "Yes," Marta agreed, reaching out to take Valen's now mortal hand, "and that makes every moment precious." The heart of compassion settled into a steady, warm glow in her chest. No longer divine fire, but human love made manifest. 3 months after the night that changed everything, Marta sat in her garden, watching the first spring flowers push through the last patches of winter snow. The healing herbs grew as abundantly as ever, though she could no longer coax impossible blooms from barren soil with a touch. Her gifts had become something more human, more precious for their limitations. Valen knelt beside her, his mortal hands dark with honest earth as he helped plant seedlings they had started together in her cottage. The man who had once commanded supernatural legions now found deep satisfaction in the simple rhythm of preparing soil and nurturing growth. His face bore lines that spoke of laughter and worry in equal measure, the beautiful imperfections of a life fully lived. "The council meeting went well?" Marta asked, noting the contentment in his expression. "Better than expected. Baron Aldric's proposal for the protection accord has support from 3 neighboring provinces. Lords who once dismissed such ideas as fantasy are now eager to formalize agreements with supernatural beings who seek peaceful coexistence." The new dawn amulet at her throat, carved by Valen from wood taken from the village's sacred oak, caught the afternoon light as she smiled. It was a simple thing, nothing like the silver pendant that had marked her divine heritage, but it carried something more valuable than ancient power. It held the love of someone who had chosen mortality for the chance to grow old beside her. "And Eleanor's school?" she prompted, knowing he had stopped there on his way home from the capital, thriving beyond all expectations. 20 children from 5 villages, learning to read alongside lessons in herb craft and healing. Little Annie Fletcher has proven remarkably gifted at teaching the younger ones. Marta felt warm pride bloom in her chest, where the heart of compassion had once blazed with divine fire. Elena's decision to establish a school for children showing unusual gifts had surprised everyone, except those who knew her best. The woman who had once led the chorus of mockery against Marta had become the village's fiercest advocate for protecting and nurturing those who were different. Through her cottage window, she could see the main road, where Baron Aldric's men maintained their patrol alongside volunteers from the village. The compact between human and supernatural had been formalized with ceremony and law, but it lived in the daily choices of ordinary people who chose understanding over fear. Father Benedict emerged from the forest path, carrying a bundle of herbs they had gathered together that morning. The priest had undergone his own transformation in the months since the harvest feast. His theology expanded to embrace mysteries that church doctrine had never contemplated. His sermons now spoke of divine love working through unexpected vessels, of redemption offered to all who genuinely sought it. "The preparations are complete," he announced, settling onto the bench Valen had built beside Marta's garden gate. "Lady Catherine's fever has broken, and she asks for you specifically to oversee her recovery." Marta nodded, unsurprised. Word of her healing practice had spread beyond Ravenscroft's borders, drawing those who suffered from ailments both physical and spiritual. She could no longer work miraculous instant cures, but her combination of herb craft, medical knowledge, and hard-won wisdom proved equally effective in most cases. More importantly, she had trained others. Margaret Fletcher had proven surprisingly adept at brewing healing teas, while Timothy showed promise with injury treatment. Even some of Baron Aldric's former soldiers had requested instruction in field medicine, understanding that true protection sometimes required healing rather than violence. Annie Fletcher appeared at the garden gate, her school satchel over her shoulder, and her face bright with the particular joy of a child who had spent the day learning wonderful things. At 8 years old, she already showed promise of becoming a remarkable healer, though her gifts remained firmly grounded in the human realm. "Aunt Marta," she called, using the honorary title all the village children had adopted. "Teacher Elena says to tell you that the delegation from the northern provinces will arrive next week. They want to discuss establishing a healing school in their capital city." "What do you think?" Valen asked quietly, his hand finding hers among the soil and seedlings. Another journey to unknown territories, more skeptical nobles to convince, more frightened people to win over? Marta considered the question while watching Annie help Father Benedict sort through their gathered herbs. The girl's natural empathy and quick mind would serve her well in any future she chose, but her eagerness to help others marked her as one who would follow the healing path, regardless of official recognition. "I think," Marta said finally, "that healing isn't something you do in one place. It's something you carry wherever love is needed." The sound of approaching hoofbeats announced another visitor, though these came from the direction of the village rather than the wider world. Elena rode up the path on her sturdy mare, her practical riding dress a far cry from the scarlet gown she had worn to the harvest feast that changed everything. "Marta," she called, dismounting with the easy grace of someone who had learned to navigate all of life's challenges with equal determination. "There's someone I'd like you to meet." Behind her came a young woman, whose bearing spoke of noble birth, but whose eyes held the particular weariness of someone who had travelled, far seeking what others could not provide. She moved with the careful precision of someone managing chronic pain, and Marta's trained senses immediately recognized the signs of an illness that defied conventional treatment. "Lady Catherine," Elena performed the introductions. "May I present Marta of Ravenscroft and her partner Lord Valen. I believe you'll find them exactly what you need." As the newcomer approached, Marta felt the familiar stirring of purpose that had driven her for decades. Not divine compulsion now, but human choice. The decision to use her gifts in service of others, to stand between suffering and those who endured it, to build bridges where others saw only chasms. "Welcome to our home," she said, rising from the garden with dirt-stained hands and a heart full of possibilities. "Tell me how we can help." The spring afternoon stretched around them like a promise of growth and renewal, while the sacred oak whispered ancient blessings over a village that had learned to treasure its protectors rather than fear them.